And then I thought I should roam about this area and try and find where it came from. I managed to find the place which is up there. And this is where I took a little bigger piece of stone for sculpture. And that was the beginning of stone sculpture in Zimbabwe.
Joram Mariga is now widely recognized as the father of Zimbabwean sculpture. It's certainly true that in the province of Nyanga, he formed the first important group of artists.
This is where I started soapstone carving in 1958. And there used to be a lot of other sculptors. John Takawira was living up there, and Bernard Manyandure was living the other side of the river. And most of the young sculptors were coming to practice while I was staying at that white surface there. That was my house.
It's often impossible to identify the beginnings of a movement in art, but certainly to this house came the very first stone sculptors. At the same time, 150 miles to the west, foundations were laid for another important group.
The building had started. The foundations were about 2 foot high, and I had to be there to complete the building. And every day, or pretty well every day, I'd talk to a chap there, an African, who was working somewhere. He wasn't working on the building, and he used to talk, and he had the most beautiful smile the world's ever seen. I liked him, we got chatting. He's obviously quite a magic man. He knew I was the right guy to talk to or something. We used to talk every day, every day, every day. And during that time, he told me all about the Shona people, about their mysticism, about their dance, their music. And finally, on to sort of mystical things, he gradually, after a long time, because they're very reticent, they don't want to tell white people anything. But he told me a tremendous lot.
Thomas Mukorobwa is the man who introduced Frank McEwen to the ways of the Shona. As a sculptor, his work is celebrated outside the National Gallery, whilst inside, to this day, he still works in the gallery shop.
He never been in Africa. I think he was born with it. He had that culture, because in that time when he works, it was at very difficult times, because that time we were not together. We were a bit separated from our previous government. They were not taking us as near as white, because why I'm saying that, he was in a very difficult, but he was forcing himself, you know, to be associating with the African. And he slept in the bush as nobody that time who has slept in the bush. And he accepted himself that I'm a friend to anybody. As we go on, he decided that we could, can you negotiate with other people so that you can be a lot of you, and then we can open up a workshop of painting.
Well, he started the painting. He made a painting, and it was a portrait of Sir Roy Walensky, who was then the Prime Minister, or he was, talking with me, and I apparently was telling Sir Roy how to be with the Africans. And that gave me the idea, here we are, we can do something. I can find these guys, and in no time, what is called the Bush Telegraph brought people in.
McEwen formed the workshop school in 1957. But it wasn't until 5 years later, in 1962, that Pat Pierce, a friend of his, brought along Joram Mariga with some of his stone carving.
He came to me with this little present of a milk jug. I think, well, there's an Englishman, he likes his tea, I'll give him an English milk jug. It's rather more beautiful, the English milk jug, but that's what he brought to me, and I was very happy with his courtesy. And I said, well, what would happen if you made a head? He said, oh, I'll make your head. So he brought me this terrible head, which is quite airport. And I said, what would you do if you made a picture of one of your great ancestors? He said, oh, that would be very different.
And that was how it happened. The combination of the workshop school with the Nyanga group created what was possibly the most powerful stable of sculptors since the Italian Renaissance. And the medium would be stone.
He wanted each individual, each artist, to be himself. Yes. since one feels, he's an artist, he felt, he was capable of creating. So therefore, he just gave us all the freedom to do what we want, no matter whatever one feels like doing, should do it.
All the time, his concern was to encourage local talent. And he started a workshop school in our National Gallery, which was so successful beyond his dreams even, and successful not in a monetary terms, but in terms of people expressing themselves. He was so influential in world art that he was able to bring to this country major directors of different museums, like the director of the Museum of Modern Arts in New York. And he was able to arrange fantastic exhibitions in our newly built National Gallery. And he ran major exhibitions all over the world, including in what was then considered the pinnacle of success for a sculptor, which was Rodin Museum in Paris.
The Rodin Museum was not the first international exhibition. There had been some in London and one a year earlier in Paris. But it was the most important. 30 sculptors exhibited, and of the 99 sculptures, all but 2 were sold to some of the wealthiest and most discerning buyers in Europe. To Europeans, African art was no longer history. It had come back to life.
Ça a été extraordinaire parce que Franck venait à la maison quand il n'était pas en Afrique et il racontait les histoires de Shona. Donc il nous racontait les histoires de son aigle, il nous racontait l'histoire de ses sculpteurs. Mais entre ce qu'il racontait, les photos qu'il nous avait montrées et puis voir les sculptures, c'était pas pareil du tout. Alors voir les sculptures, c'était brusquement tout un monde fantastique avec des animaux extraordinaires, des êtres comme on n'a pas l'habitude d'en voir. Il y avait des sorcières qui se promenaient, il y avait des démons, il y avait des animaux incroyables. Et tout ça surgissait au musée Rodin. C'est pas un musée où on voit ce genre de choses d'ordinaire. Et donc, ça, dans cette pierre qui est une pierre du Zimbabwe, la serpentine verte ou la serpentine rouge, et c'était voir ça, ça a été vraiment un choc.
In the 15 years before the Rodin exhibition, the number of sculptors had multiplied enormously. There was a new colony to the north at Tenganengi, and Frank, fearing the impact of commercial pressures, had moved his workshop to a safe haven in the Eastern Highlands.
My worry was, as soon as I got the thing going and it became slightly famous after about 10 years or so, I began to worry about dealers and sort of Americanization, what I call Coca-Colaization was going on, and everything could be spoilt there. I saw it coming. So I decided to move, and I went all over the place searching. And I finally found this place, Fukutu. This was the great place. And I came back and I said to Thomas, you must send your people to see it. And he sent his people, and they spent days there. And they said, oh, it's a great center. It was a great center of spirituality, and there are lots of graves there, and it's absolutely dead right.
By moving his sculptors out to the country, Frank had begun a process of liberation that affected their work deeply. For the Shona, the dead remain with the living and are present in the form of spirits. And it is contact with these spirits that strengthens and underlines the sense of being. Sylvester Mubai was the first sculptor at Fukutu.
I know my culture. I know how to celebrate my spirits. Other people that are following the English, the European culture, they don't know what they are doing. Myself, I don't live my culture. People, they don't know how they grew, who's going to put their spirits. I'm an education man, I'm working a good job, I'm a doctor, what. But other doctors, they go back to see their parents and to think for their spirits. See the grandmother and the grandfather, to ask them, what do you do? Can you do it for us, please? Then they do it. They cope from there. During my lifetime, I'll do it before I die, to leave the culture to my family. It can continue on. No matter, it can overseas, it can be a BA man, it can go to university. But you must remember that the spirit can keep him.
If you can look at most of the rocks here, they are rocks, but in them they've got human life. If you can look carefully at this one here, the big one to the east, it's a big woman facing inside. The one in the middle is a big man or a chief, and far to the right of the middle man, there is a woman with the head, with her back and one arm closed inside, with a big skirt going downwards. And far to our right, over that way, is the home for the baboons. So this place is very important for the sculptors.
People believe that it carries a human spirit, not of its own, but someone who had died before. Let's say, for example, if one dies and before people do ceremony, because we always do a ceremony after a year when one is died. Before the ceremony is done, the spirit of that man goes, and stay with the baboon. And during that period, that baboon, it will behave in a strange, behavior that it's easily to recognize that that baboon must be possessed by a human spirit. But once the ceremony is done, it means that you are taking your spirit back to the home.
From the beginning, Frank had insisted that the Shona men draw from their own culture. And for some, this meant a kind of awakening. The late John Tagawira worked heavily around the tribal myths of eagles and skeletal baboons, of death and the spirit world. Against a background of increasing political instability, where the old white regime was being challenged, the Shona culture was reassuringly strong. But another strength was emerging, that of the sculpture. John's younger brothers, Bernard and Lazarus, take their tribal history seriously, but their work is more worldly, though no less sacred.
Today in Zimbabwe, most of our older artists, they believe in spirits. Let's say they say this is a possessive woman and whatsoever. I don't have anything like that myself because I don't believe in spirits. I believe in saying a sculpture is a sculpture. There is nothing like a spirit out of it. You see, my ideas comes from women. You see, that is the very shortcut answer. The shortcut answer is my ideas comes from women. You see, though I'm big, I'm from a woman. Right? My director was a woman. My mother was my director. She's my really teacher. That's why I love women. I put most of my sculptures, I put women into the sculpture.
There is a common language for sculptors, and I would like to think of myself as a sculptor from anywhere. I don't have to be pinned to Shona. Yes, I am a Shona person. Yes, my beliefs are Shona in one way or another. Yes, I was brought up like a Shona man, it may be my ideals sometimes are influenced by this Shona background. But as far as sculpting is concerned, those are only ideals. When it comes to sculpting, it is the matter of whether the piece of sculpture is good or bad. Calling it Shona does not make it good. Calling it whatever does not make it good. It is the life that you put in the piece of sculpture that talks to people.
In fact, the term Shona sculpture was becoming a misnomer by the late 60s because at Tenganengi, where Lazarus is going to quarry stone, a colony had started around Tom Bloomfield, a tobacco farmer beaten by the sanctions.
Hello, exchange. 1223 here. Can I have 1440? Gurui.
Because his sculptors had also been tobacco workers, itinerants by tradition, their work represented all of the styles of southern Africa, from Malawi to Zaire, from Angola to Mozambique, and not just Shona. Tenganengi is the base for 70 sculptors working in the region, with about 20 resident at any one time. For all its 150 miles from Nyanga by road, it owes its origins directly to that handful of men that gathered around Joram Mariga in the 50s.
What happened was that a pupil of Joram Mariga's, called Crispin Chavanduka, who had worked under Joram Mariga in Nyanga for some 3 years, but whose home was in Garuve, where Tenganengi is situated, went back to his home and found that on the farm Tenganengi, which belonged to Tom Bloomfield, it runs up to the Great Dyke of Zimbabwe, and the Great Dyke is full of serpentine. And the particular serpentine that is found there is ideal for carving. He went to Tom Bloomfield and said to him that there was this beautiful serpentine. And Tom said to him, well, can you teach me to carve? Because Tom was a most unusual tobacco farmer. He was a dreamer. He loved art, and he wanted to sculpt. The thought of this community started to germinate in Tom's mind. And there was a need for it, because at the time, sanctions against Rhodesia, as we were then, were beginning to bite, and tobacco farmers were one of the first to feel the pinch. The government cut their quota in half, and the price was cut in half. So most tobacco farmers found their income down to a quarter and even less of what it was before. The first thing they had to do was to start to put off people. Tom had a very special relationship with these people, and he was very upset about having to dismiss everybody. And I think when this idea of a community of sculptors or craftspeople came to mind, he jumped at it straight away.
I went to my wife and I said, I'm going to become an artist. And she said, but Tom, I married you for a farmer. What are you going to do with all your farm laborers who walked from Angola and Mozambique to come and work for you? And I said, well, I'll train them to be craftsmen or artists, or I don't know what we'll do. And so we started sculpting, and I'd known Lemon Moses for about 14 years before that. He started to make a sculpture which was a sphere on top of a tapered cylinder, and the eyes were bulging out, and the nose was shaped like a shovel, and the lips were like blades, and it had no ears. And I was quite astonished to see the progress on the sculpture he was making, and I couldn't understand why he was doing it like that, but it had so much energy and force in it and power. So I took some of the sculptures that we'd made after 3 weeks and took them to the National Gallery, my teacher, Crispin's eagle, and my own sculptures.
So he brought an old man called Lemon Moses, and I took him into our workshop where the chaps were carving, And I've never seen anything like the enlightenment of this man. And he just lit up. He was sort of hallucinated. He saw these chaps carving. He'd never seen sculpture at all. We went away, sort of fully charged. A couple of weeks later, he came back with this sculpture. It was the first one ever made by this man who'd never seen sculpture in a place where nobody'd seen sculpture. And this mother with 2 children protected by a totem snake was his first work, and it grows on me. It's extremely beautiful. He is still there. He's a dear old man, Lemon Moses.
And anybody could come up the road, and I'd give him some tools, give him a chasing hammer, and then he'd get maize meal, beans, fish, salt, monkey nuts, and sometimes a bottle of homemade wine. People had a sort of a positive feeling about Tanganenge.
Tanganenge, of course, developed some of the greatest artists, Henry Munyaradzi, Josiah Manzi, Bernard Matamere. One of our greatest young talents, Tafuma Gudsa, considers Bernard Matamere as the greatest sculptor of Zimbabwe because of his command of form and volume. And of course, he is a very fine sculptor. But he was not, in fact, recognized until 1986, when we sent through the National Gallery work from the garden here to New Delhi Triennale. And Matamere's work won the first prize in the Triennale in sculpture. Since then, his career has just taken off, and people have realized what a powerful sculptor he is and how African in his themes he is, and uncompromisingly African. Now his work is in museums all over the world.
Our prime activity was the making of sculpture, and to encourage other people to come and try their talent, so that they could establish themselves in a creative and an economic sense. In fact, we'd all have a good job, and we'd also get some money. Plus that we'd have some kind of an identity, because we were sanctions-ridden people. We were in the United Nations sanctions, which affected all the people, black or white or anybody. All of us, we were sort of, it was like being an outcast of the world. It was an extraordinary position to feel like that. We thought the whole thing would blow over in a few, and that Mr. Wilson and Mr. Smith would sort it out, but both of them had a very, very different and a hard stance, and it didn't happen.
Starting in tomorrow's Daily Mirror, Woman, the Sexual Tiger, how they dominate their men, their desire to be on top. Plus, Basic Instinct, the movie that shocked and rocked America. See this new Sharon Stone Michael Douglas thriller absolutely free by the Daily Mirror tomorrow.
If you collect Tiger tokens, you'll find a whole lot more than you bargained for in the biggest ever Esso collection. There's a dazzling selection of gifts, and now with Tiger tokens you can stay in the magical world of Euro Disney. Get collecting those Tiger tokens!
In 1980, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe was 80% Shona. The War of Independence was more than a struggle against white colonialism. It was the fight to rebuild and re-establish identity lost under those long years of suppression. The Shona are rural, peace-loving people. They had been herded into townships by the whites to meet their service requirements. But their tribal ways continued, and even in the congestion of the townships, they kept their precious cattle. It is said that they had no art, but the observation is not fair. There is plenty of evidence that they had a natural affinity with stone and that they were extremely skilled carvers. Who can say how much of Frank McEwen's success was just a piece of huge, historic luck?
I'm a total believer in what I call the permanence of culture. It's in you, and you can never escape from it. The fundamental interior, the permanence of culture is there. And that permanence of culture will come out if it has a chance. And it had stopped in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, for several hundred years because they'd been invaded, and these gentle, spiritual, wonderful people who are the Shona, highly mystical and religious, they'd stopped carving. And of course there had been sculpture in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, 400 or 500 years ago. There were these famous birds, which was the sacred eagle, the Chipungu birds, apparently placed all round the walls of the fort. By the permanence of culture, they started up again.
Bernard Takawira, John's brother, owns a 5,000-acre farm on the outskirts of Harare, bought and paid for through his international success. Before independence, the farm would have been owned by whites, and an impossible dream for a Shona man like Bernard. Now, as with his neighbors Henry Munyaradzi and Nicholas Mukombramwa, he leads the life of a master sculptor surrounded by good stone.
I like to leave my stones scattered about. And I want to move them separate from each other. Nothing is lost here. They look ignored, but they are, I know where they are. But sometimes, I also move them, from time to time, and see that they could be talking, from a different angle. This one, I think, is a complete piece of sculpture. That may sound strange to you, but perhaps if you looked at it from this direction, you will find out that it, to me, is like a baby in blankets. And I think it's complete. I really think it's complete. I looked at it, and I like the shape very much. And sometimes a rock is shouting and saying, look, just take off this and take off that, and I want to express myself. And if I'm careful enough and I listen to it, we together succeed. They can also be pretty disturbing. The rule about them is that when you get them, you are very first relationship. You give them the hardest bangs ever. If they want to break, let them break then, rather than to work on it until you are full of hope and you're excited, and in that moment it goes in half. You see, the harder the rock for me, the better. I'll tell you, the years that have passed, I'm a strong man. And I could work into a rock within a very short time with my hands. But you see, when the rock is hard, it poses a resistance, which will give me time to think properly. And that's a virtue. The harder it is, the better. We communicate better. This shape is very good. The only problem is the size. This is what is deterring me right now. I have to gather enough strength to attack it. Rocks are very intimidating. It will say, what can you do? I'm a rock. I'll have to gather enough strength one day to say, I am better than you, rock. And we fight. When we made the sculpture, we heat water in a tub like you saw. And we put this piece of sculpture in a bag, and then we immerse it in this hot water and let it boil for a time. This is to open the pores, so that when we apply the wax, it goes right into it. And when it cools down, the wax is there. It is seasoned for a long time.
sculpture has become very intellectual. It's become very clinical. It's become almost unattainable to the normal person. But here you have sculpture which relates to people, which relates to everyday life, which people can touch and they can enthuse over, and they put it in their homes like one might put a painting in one's home. So I think it's going to have major impacts, already is beginning to find its way into museums and so on. But of course there's entrenched resistance, because African art, as I've said, cannot be contemporary African art. African art, in terms of Western opinion, must be from the last century. I often make a comparison to the Impressionists in the early part of the century, where their work was ridiculed and laughed at and not accepted. The first generation artists made a great contribution, not only in art terms, but in terms of saying through their art, we are a people of our own, we have our own culture, we have our own way of life. And in that way, making their own people aware that they were a community of their own, a people of their own.
Nicholas Mukomberamwa, like many of the founding sculptors, had been taught carving before meeting Frank McEwen. Serima Mission was created in 1952 by Father Gruber, a Swiss missionary who had trained as an architect. Out in the bush, 30 miles from the nearest road, Father Gruber and his young pupils made every brick and carved every detail of this magnificent church and school. After showing the pupils masks from West Africa, he got them to carve the story of Christianity in their own tribal way. In White Rhodesia, and indeed in Zimbabwe today, mission schools like Serima, and there are less than a handful, represent the only art training for young blacks.
I still appreciate what I learned at Serima Mission, but then I began to find that, at Serima Mission we're sort of all doing things, in one line, like things about the Bible. But now, when Mr. McEwen told us that, you've got lots of things that you can make, anything. So I found myself talking about my own religion of Shona people. I think it's some kind of remedy, really, for me to survive. It's just like somebody, who is sick. He has got to take tablets, for him to survive. So as far as I'm concerned, I find that without it, there is no life. I'm talking about really sculptures. I'm not just... it's very difficult to express it, to explain some of these things, because it's something that is, which I feel that it's like communicating, with the unknown. And exposing it to us here. There are times when I can't get any inspiration. I don't know where it is gone. So that's why I say I feel that probably it's the time when I am in touch with the outside, and I'm able to create anything. But once that inspiration is gone, it's just boom. I can't work.
They carved in frenzy, absolutely in frenzy, because they could see this spirit image and they had to carve it. It's not like like our kind of thing where they measure and they copy. They have models posing, and so it was there. It was a three-dimensional image within their minds, and they had quickly to do it, and they executed with frenzy. I've seen that many a time, almost possessed.
That message can be, it's just like writing a book. People can then, in 20 years or 30 years, will still read that book. So in this, I would say it's more spiritual, that people will still feel the message I was trying to put through.
In the years to come, the greatest artistic expressions will emanate from this country. One of the great aspects of the future of this development of art expression in Africa is the new generation of sculptors. One of the main is Taphuma Gutsa, who has inspired many of the others. I can only express my own opinion, but I consider him one of the greatest sculptors in the world today, in terms of his imagination, his originality, his complete command of his media. His attitude is that Europeans and Western people have borrowed from Africa for so many years. There's nothing wrong in him borrowing from Europe. So he regards himself not necessarily as an African or a Zimbabwe or a Shona sculptor, but as an international sculptor. But obviously his roots are African. So throughout his work, the African atmosphere and the African feeling permeates. It's a very, very great talent.
In my opinion, there are a group of core artists like Mkomberano, Joram himself, Sylvester Mbaye, Leighton Dandarika, John Takawira. In fact, all the Takawiras, to an extent. Now, these guys created a mythology. They took a lot from the legends of the people and actually made solid imagery out of them. And for them, it has worked. But when we came along, we were people who had been to school, educated with a view to become teachers, professional people, you know? We couldn't just jump into the wagon and copy these guys because they had explored a certain area of the mythology. So in my case, I decided to take another deviate from that, work on the object as an object rather than let this sculpture hang around the myth. The myth is secondary, but the form, for me, is much more important.
Taphuma Gutsa is Shona. He learned art in a mission school and lived for a time in a shanty town. But then a British Council scholarship took him to London and 3 years at Central School of Art, where he made friends from all over the world. His wife, Nicole, is Austrian. They travel widely, often to his international exhibitions, and his lifestyle is more that of a rock and roll star than of a sculptor. But Taphuma has seen what the founding sculptors didn't see. He has studied Picasso, Braque, and Brancusi. And as they were changed by what they saw of Africa, so he has been changed.
When I first came, friends asked me, what do you think of the land? And I told them, well, this is the land God gave to Moses, you know? When I grew up, I was known as Moses. But for some reasons, I decided I've got to get back my real name. Because first, when a child is born, it's given an African name. Then, if your parents involve you with the church, automatically, in the olden days, you had to cut that Shona name out and your ethnic name and end up with a name like Moses, you know? It's like the promised land for me. Very soon, when the rains come really heavy, there's going to be a lot of mushrooms around, edible things. And, you know, what more do you ask for? Workable stones, edible mushrooms. Yeah.
With the relaxed and successful lifestyle demonstrated by Taphuma Gutsa and his contemporaries, it's little wonder that every kid on the block wants to be a sculptor. In the townships, where a good salary is £30 a month, a good sculpture that takes a month to carve could fetch at least £300, often paid in hard currency. In fact, Chitungwiza is possibly the only ghetto in the world where you can fight your way out with a hammer and chisel instead of the more usual methods of football, boxing, or rock and roll. In a young country with no formal art education, this can mean nothing but good. But there are dangers.
You see, we have a vast unemployment problem in this country. Many educated young people are coming onto the market every year and can't find jobs. And some of them look to any fielding where they can make a living. Sculpture is one of those. So there's been a great upsurge of young people getting involved in sculpture. Some of them strive to find their own identity, and many of them have succeeded. Others are completely commercial, and they simply look at what's selling and try to repeat that. And that is where the dangers lie. And unfortunately, we have a buying community who very often doesn't know the difference. So very often the copyist is successful financially, and the real artist struggles.
What is frightening me for an example, we've got the competitions once per year at the National Art Gallery, like the Zimbabwe Heritage. The Zimbabwe Heritage, I think very soon it is going to help to spoil the image of the traditional Shona sculpture, because there are judges invited to come and judge the sculptures. And the people who are winning, who are being given the prizes by the judges, are the professional sculptors. Once a professional sculptor, like Nicholas, like Henry, or myself, or anybody, if I can get a prize at the Zimbabwe Heritage, then all the young sculptors will flock and copy all what I'm doing. And this will help to spoil the young generation to produce their own designs.
With young artists, they ought to take their time. And how to teach them now? You see, like myself, how I teach my artists, my young artists, is I bring up some stones here. You can see I've got many of stones here, loose stones. I bring up loose stones. I say, look here. If anyone who wants to be an artist, he ought to do his own idea. If he copies my work, what I do sometimes, I rather get a 14-pound hammer, I break the sculpture. All I sign my name. That is going to be my sculpture. That's what I do. That's how I teach. I'm very tough at teaching.
The danger is not only for amongst those young people, but even some of the older, well-established sculptors are doing themselves harm, I think, by repeating subject matter and so on. And in a way, theirs is more invidious even than the younger people. But if you had been in this country, as I have been in the country, through a long period of war and great difficulties, it's very easy to forgive a man when he is making things to sell, rather than creating new work which might take months to sell. They all have to eat initially. They all have to look after their families. But having said that, you take, in the bottom of the office there are a number of John Takawira's lying. They're little heads. He used to call them his hot-cross buns. I once said to him, if Frank McEwen saw these, John, what would he say? And he turned away and said, I know what you mean, Mr. Guthrie. But he went through a period of reproducing these small little heads. When you see 10 or 15 of them, you're appalled by them. You think, what is John doing as an artist of great stature? But take any one of those and isolate them, put them under some light, and you begin to see that in fact it's not a copy. It's a beautiful little head on its own. And so often we judge our artists by Western and European standards. And we judge them even unfairly. Brancusi did 30 or 40 of his soaring birds. We don't say Brancusi was churning out work. We marvel at each work, and we say, and yet they were almost identical. But if Henry does that, he's criticized, or Bernard Matamera. And in a sense, they need to be criticized. Their standards need to be maintained. But they have had great financial struggles, times when they couldn't feed their families, times when they couldn't put shoes on their feet. And I understand that and I sympathize with it. But at the same time, I'm always trying to say to people, create and don't mass produce. And, we want works of art, not airport art, not curios.
I think it was an awakening. You know, art is always the leader. In every point in history, art tells a story before it happens. And that's an absolute fact. And I think they were telling the story of their liberation. I don't mean political liberation, but sort of their sort of right to freedom to go back to their own history and escape from all the persecution they'd had. And I think they felt this new thing that was coming, and that was there. And I just happened to be, I suppose, the right man, the right place, the right time, and I saw it there, and I helped bring it out. That's all. I mean, it was there. I couldn't have put it there. The great thing was all there. It was all there. I just happened to be a sort of medium to help bring it out. And the tragedy is that the white man doesn't know. He thinks with his missionaries and his talk and his Coca-Cola, he's got nothing. Nothing.
Because he was very much in favor of the African cause in this country and very controversial and very outspoken in his views upon art, he became a controversial figure in this country, and he was almost forced to resign in 1972.
You see, when I was there, I had many enemies because so many white people didn't like what I was doing. That's finally I had to resign. I think it's quite possible if I went back now, I'd have the same kind of trouble from different people who would think I was trying to stop them from becoming Coca-Colaized, which is my famous phrase.